What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Here we are with another reaction video. We have India's most chilling historical event, the Kashmir Exodus. And before we can dive into this video, make sure you guys subscribe to the channel, ring notification bell, give a video a thumbs up. Let's hear about this event.
For centuries, Kashmir was home to Muslims and Hindus alike. Despite religious differences, historic discrimination, and episodes of violence, members of both faiths shared a common land, language, and culture there. This common identity, known as Kashmiriyat, united Kashmir's residents with a sense of community and loyalty. In 1989, this unity was shattered with the outbreak of an insurgency that rages to this day. A wave of monstrous killings and brutal repression created the conditions for a massive exodus of nearly all of Kashmir's Hindus. Today, on A Day in History, we'll discover what led to this mass movement of people. We'll see how the Kashmir Valley unraveled and descended into violence, how public lynchings and sexual violence became the norm, and why this exodus of over 100,000 people is so easily forgotten. If that sounds interesting to you, then remember to leave a like on this video and subscribe to our channel for more interesting historical topics. When India and Pakistan gained independence in August 1947, the fate of the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir was undecided. Kashmir's Muslim majority were inclined to Pakistan, but the Hindu authorities leaned towards India. A Muslim rebellion broke out with assistance from Pakistan, prompting the Maharaja to ask for Indian intervention in exchange for joining India. The First Kashmir War set the tone for Indo-Pakistani relations, and when it ended in January 1949, it left Kashmir divided between the two nations. The majority of Kashmir remained Muslim under Indian rule, but within this new democratic structure, they were able to wield power instead of the Hindu minority. Muslims dominated politics, economics, and society in post-1947 Kashmir, while Hindus faced mounting discrimination. Hindus had their land taken and redistributed, were denied promotions and jobs, and had little in the way of political power. Meanwhile, Kashmir's Muslims were partial towards Pakistan, which led to tension with Indian authorities and security forces, who reacted harshly to any whispers of Kashmiri separatism and passed oppressive laws to counter it. In time, Islamic militancy grew in the valley. The Jamaat-e
So dang, it seems like so many things going on at one time where you got here in Kashmir, there's more so a Muslim presidents than a Hindu presidents, but yet it's under the Indian government, but the Muslims wield more power there, and it seems like they kind of oppress the Hindus there because they are the minority as far as relocating their housing, as far as you're not getting the job, you're not getting the promotion, as far as things such as that. But then India's like, and then those Muslims are more partial to Pakistan, you feel me? And India's like, nah, like y'all under our power, you can't be partial to Pakistan if you're gonna be a part of India. And so they start putting laws and things in place to undermine those Muslims that are in Kashmir, because those tensions are getting high between Pakistan and India. Okay, this is a very interesting situation.
Islamic group worked its influence through schools, mosques, and political activism to encourage separatist and anti-India feeling in Kashmir. Meanwhile, Pakistan was eager to support this. After all, India had helped Bangladesh break away in 1971, and it was eager to repay the favor by splitting off a piece of India. Pakistan began funding and arming militant groups in Kashmir and encouraging violence, most notably the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, JKLF. The result was an ever-growing crisis between Kashmir's Hindus and Muslims. Sporadic violence was a rule of life in the valley, with occasional outbursts of mass chaos. In February 1986, for example, as many as 2,000 people died in religious riots, with homes, shops, and temples destroyed. Credible allegations of election manipulation in 1987 by the Indian government against Muslim interests in Jammu and Kashmir was a final straw for many, and the mood in
Wow.
Kashmir moved decisively in favor of separatism and militancy. JKLF bomb attacks in July 1988 and riots in Srinagar that August showed that relations between Muslims and Hindus, both in the Indian government and in the valley, had all but collapsed.
Oh my
Kashmir's
God.
pundits were well aware of their tenuous position in their homeland. Between 1947 and 1988, around half of them had already fled out of fear.
Oh,
Those who remained
wow.
by the end of the 1980s, numbering around 120,000, would soon follow.
My God. So tensions were just absolutely too high here, and it seems like the Muslim and Pakistan was all for it, since I guess India helped Bangladesh break away from Pakistan, and Pakistan was very eager to return this favor, they said. And so Pakistan is arming these terrorist groups and everything, and helping them to fight against the Hindus in India, helping them fight against the Indian government and everything. And you hear just so many people losing their lives, and you hate to hear that. I can't stand hearing people die, but so many people losing their lives, and in this group just going around bombing and killing and doing whatever they want. You can imagine tensions just are only going to get higher and higher for sure. This is insane.
1989 was a decisive year. Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan left mountains of military equipment behind, which soon found its way into Kashmiri militant hands.
Wow.
The example of Afghanistan shrugging off one of the world's most powerful empires inspired Kashmiri Muslims to assert their own independence through armed struggle. Militants seized upon this mood to spark an insurgency that continues to this day. The experience of Kashmiri Muslims and their conflict with the Indian government is complex and deserving of its own video. Certainly, not every Kashmiri Muslim supported how militants would treat the Hindus, and nor did every Hindu support how the Indian government treated Muslims. For this video, we'll stay focused on the experience of Kashmir's Hindu minority amidst this emerging insurgency. But that isn't to say that Muslims weren't suffering injustices in Kashmir in this period as well. Anger against the Indian government translated into militant violence against Hindus in Kashmir. For example, community leader and lawyer Tika Lal Taplu, who had served as the vice president of the BJP in Jammu and Kashmir, was gunned down by militants near his home on September 14, 1989. A similar attack claimed the life of another legal figure, Neela Khan Ganju, on November 4th. He had sentenced a founding member of the JKLF to death for terrorist activity and was gunned down in broad daylight on a busy high street. A similar public murder befell social worker P.N. Bhatt, who was shot dead in a marketplace in Anantnag in the middle of the day on December 27th. These killings were not random. The militants sought out government and political figures, but also community leaders and anyone whose death might destabilize the Hindu community. Such an approach has been common in ethnic violence throughout history. By decapitating a community's leadership, that community became more fearful and vulnerable. These goals were made explicit in January 1990, when pamphlets, newspapers, and radio broadcasts began calling for Muslim Kashmiris to rise up and throw out non-Muslims. The Urdu paper Aftab was clear. The aim of the present struggle is supremacy of Islam in Kashmir, in all walks of life and nothing else. Anyone who puts any hurdle in our way will be annihilated. But the militants took the pundits' mere existence as enough of a hurdle to justify annihilation. Take the murder of M.L. Bhan on January 15th. Militants stopped the bus he and his son were on just outside Srinagar. They shot him and left his body and his weeping son on the side of the road. The spike in militant activity caught the attention of India's government, especially after a government minister's daughter was kidnapped and ransomed for the release of several Kashmiri militants. Unable to control the violence, the chief minister of Jammu and Kashmir, the Muslim Farooq Abdullah, was dismissed, and the region was...
This is just absolutely getting out of hand. This is getting crazy. This is wild. And I know he said, like he said, he's only really telling the story from one perspective in this video. And he's saying that Muslims, he's not saying that Muslims didn't suffer in this time period as well. But right now, in this video, he's focusing on the Hindu that were in the minority. And my God, it just looks like it was an absolute scary time for them, for government officials, anyone. Like I'm surprised they didn't make Kashmir a Muslim state, because this, it seems like they got all the weapons. It'd be absolutely horrifying to be living in this place as a non-Muslim. I'll say that.
Placed under the rule of the Hindu governor Jagmohan. Naturally, there was outrage among the Muslim population.
Of course.
On January 19th, hundreds of thousands of Muslims in the valley joined protests against the incoming Jagmohan government. Not all were militants, and not all hated Hindus per se, but the January 19th protests proved to be a traumatic turning point for the Hindus in the valley. Across Kashmir, militants fueled the protests and inflamed tensions. Power cuts hit businesses and homes, but mosques were untouched. Mosques began broadcasting supportive messages for the protesters and threats to the Hindus, urging them to leave or convert in anticipation of a free Islamic Kashmir. Local police were overwhelmingly Muslim and sympathetic, so did not lift a finger when protests turned violent. Dozens of Hindus were attacked and several killed. The rest fortified themselves in their homes as shouting crowds outside called for their conversion, removal, or death. It fell to the governor's security services to respond to the January 19th protests, and their intervention only led to more bloodshed. Jagmohan's forces cracked down hard on the protests, and some 300 people were killed in clashes. As many as 100 people were killed in a single incident at Gul Kadal Bridge, when security forces opened fire on protesters. The storm of violence that consumed Kashmir in 1990 between Kashmiri Muslims and Indian security translated into more attacks on regular Hindus too. Ethnic and religious tribalism soared. Pundits were held responsible for the actions of the Indian security forces, while Muslims were treated as inseparable from the militants. Any remaining social harmony or trust in the valley collapsed. As each group,
it's just all-out war, and it's like you gotta pick a side. And even if you're not the one that holds the same beliefs as far as harming or hurting or wanting somebody to convert or anything. If you have no problem with, if you're Hindu and you have no problem with your neighbor who's a Muslim, and y'all actually get along, it doesn't matter. It seems like at this point tensions had risen so high that if you were a Hindu, you were an enemy. And same for the Indian government. If you were Muslim, you were an enemy in that area. And so it's like tensions at this point are so high. It's like both sides are looking at anyone who claimed that religion as an enemy, no matter if they had done anything or not. That's a very scary situation.
Attributed the worst to each other. Violence went from being an unfortunate extreme to something celebrated. On February 27th, Naveen Sapru was gunned down by the side of the road by militants. His killers and local Muslims then danced around his body and cheered, seeing it as a strike against India. The case of Balkrishnan Ganju similarly showed the collapse in Hindu-Muslim relations. On March 19th, militants appeared at his home, where he tried to hide from them in a barrel. However, his Muslim neighbors, angry at the Indian government, or perhaps fearful of the militants, ratted him out to the attackers. The militants gouged out his eyes and killed him in front of his wife and daughter. This distrust and hatred broke down almost every social relationship, even those between doctors and patients. Hindus reported going to the hospital and being denied treatment by Muslim doctors, who, out of malice against them or fear of militant reprisals, would rather let them die. For example, Sri Kapoor of Srinagar was attacked on March 19th and rushed to hospital, where doctors refused to treat him because they didn't want to be killed for helping Hindus. He bled to death over the next few hours. Similarly, Shiban Krishan's family was told that they had to file for police permission and protection before treating him after he was shot by militants. By the time the family had done so, the doctors had fled and Shiban died of his wounds. One of the most harrowing stories was that of the renowned poet and scholar Sarwanand Kul Premi and his son Verinder. Premi was a respected scholar who had translated the Gita into Kashmiri and had been a teacher in his community. He taught local children, Muslim and Hindu alike, to speak and write in their shared language. That meant nothing on April 28th, when a group of militants entered his home. They stripped his family of any valuables they had and ordered Premi to load them into a suitcase and come with them. Verinder insisted on staying by his father's side and went with him and the militants. Several days later, father and son were found beaten, burned, and blinded before having been strung up in a tree and shot. Sexual violence also spoke to a collapse of respect of human dignity. Numerous Hindu women were abducted, brutalized, and killed by mobs. Sarla Bhatt, a nurse working in the region, suffered that exact fate, and her body was left at a roadside in mid-April. An unnamed school teacher in Bandipora met a similarly gruesome end. Abducted from her school and abused by a group of militants, she was dismembered and her remains scattered on the side of the road as a warning to other Hindus.
See, this is just horrific. It is absolutely horrific. It is heartbreaking. It is terrible. It is awful. Like I can't imagine dismembering someone. I can't imagine blinding someone and beating them to death. It's just that evil that humanity is capable of, as it's shown time and time again in the history of the world. It's just scary. It's scary.
It appeared that the Hindus had two choices after January 19th: stay and await a violent end, or flee in hopes of safety. The vast majority chose to flee. There were 3 waves of the exodus, each coinciding with a spike in violence in the valley. The first came after January 19th. Another followed several weeks later on January 26th, coinciding with India's Republic Day. A third and final wave came in early March, although a trickle of refugees continued for months afterwards. By May, an estimated 94% of Kashmir's Hindus had fled, numbering over 100,000 people. This was no planned or coordinated venture. Conspiracy theories emerged and are still popular that Governor Jagmohan secretly arranged the exodus to clear the valley and allow his security forces free rein to target Muslims without fear of hitting Hindus. There is no evidence for this claim, and it's absurd to think that tens of thousands of people would choose to abandon their ancestral homes simply to allow a military crackdown on others.
That's what I was finna think, though. I was like, once he started talking about the Exodus and all those Hindus leaving, in my head, I was like, India's like government is gonna send in the military or whatever to take care of like all those Muslims. And so I feel like as a Muslim, you would have wanted the Hindus to stay in the area and share that area with them, because for that simple fact. But I don't, like he said, he's only telling the story from one perspective. I don't know how it was for Muslims and if they were being oppressed by the Indian government as well. So I don't know the complete situation, but just from this video alone, I don't blame the Hindus for leaving the area like that. It seems like every day would be absolute terror. And so, yeah, I'd leave too. But yeah, in knowing that they were leaving, I feel like you kind of knew the Indian military was then going to come in and at that point, since all the Hindus had leaving, I guess they were probably going to look at all the Muslims as enemies, and they weren't going to hold back. And I'm sure there's going to be more horrific death that comes along.
The truth was that virtually all pundits recognized the danger of their situation and chose to flee on their own, and did so with no help whatsoever from authorities. One unnamed historian and sociologist who lived in Srinagar described their experience of the escape. Militants had set up a cordon around their neighborhood when they learned that they would be rounded up the next day for collaborationist activity. They slipped away at night ahead of their family, and when a committee from the local mosque arrived the next day to demand they present themselves for trial, their family promised they would appear. But instead, they too escaped in the night with everything they could carry. Most of the exodus happened in January and February, with winter still gripping the valley, exposing refugees to dangerous conditions as they trudged through snow and frigid temperatures to reach safety. The government was no help. No more than 2% of refugees escaped with government assistance, while the rest were left to find their own way out. Families who were not lucky enough to have their own vehicles relied on taxis and buses, but drivers preyed on their desperation with ridiculous fees. Most refugees went to neighboring Jammu or made their way to Delhi. Camps were set up for them, but what many hoped would be a temporary disruption proved to be permanent. Some would remain in the camps for decades, and as of 2024, there has been no effort to resettle them.
My God.
Between 1986 and 1997, around 1,200 Hindus were killed in the Kashmir Valley, with as many as 500 killed at the height of violence between late 1989 and mid-1990. Meanwhile, an estimated 100,000 people were forced to flee their homes. A small number of Hindus remained in the valley past 1990. N.H. Wachlu was one. A former trade union activist with connections to the Muslims, he tried to earn his safety by filing petitions against the security forces on behalf of Muslims. That did not spare him the militants' wrath, who executed him in cold blood in December 1992. A number of massacres of remaining Hindus in Kashmir continued through the 1990s. 7 were murdered in Sangrama in March 1997. 23 were gunned down in Wandhama in 1998, when militants stole Indian security uniforms and opened fire on civilians. Nighttime raids in April of that year claimed 26 Hindu lives, with men, women, and children beheaded by militants. Such violence continued into the 2000s, with a massacre of 24 Hindus, including a child as young as 2, in the village of Nadimarg on March 24, 2003. But these Hindus represent only a small minority of a once larger group. One estimate put the number of Hindu families left in the valley in 2010 at just 800. The reaction to this humanitarian crisis was minimal. Violence between Indian security forces and Kashmiri Muslims dominated the spotlight, and Kashmir's Hindus were too often dismissed as collateral damage or deserving casualties of the wider conflict in Kashmir. International awareness of their plight is all but non-existent, but so too has been the aid of the Indian government. To this day, it has made virtually no effort to resettle them, has shown no interest in compensating their losses or trying to create circumstances where they can return to their ancestral homes. Even legal attempts to get justice for murdered victims has gone nowhere, with petitions to reopen investigations into their murders being dismissed by the Indian Supreme Court. Some Hindu activists have described the exodus as a genocide, citing the UN's definition of actions, with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, by deliberately inflicting on the group condition of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. It's easy to see why they might think that. Still, there is a war of narratives over the issue and lots of confusion over exactly what happened. For example, the 1991 book Genocide of Hindus in Kashmir by the Hindu Jammu Kashmir Sahayata Samiti group described 40 Hindu temples being destroyed in the violence in early 1990. However, an investigation in February 1993 of 23 of these temples found all but 2 of them completely intact. The scholar Sumatra Bose also challenged the death tolls presented by certain sources. Despite claims that several hundred Hindus were killed by March 1990, Bose argued that no more than 32 murders can be confirmed in Kashmir in that period. Depending on one's perspective on the issue, these arguments can be evidence of exaggeration or of downplaying the truth that is tantamount to genocide denial. What is clear is that the events in Kashmir in the last few decades are a new chapter in its history. Hindus and Muslims have lived in Kashmir for centuries. That history has been punctuated with periods of persecution under Muslim, Hindu, and foreign rulers alike. There has been violence and disagreement, but also cooperation. They shared land, language, culture, and space for centuries. For every murder or attack between Muslims and Hindus, there were many more friends, mentors, colleagues, or neighbors whose relationships crossed the religious divide. That history is all but over. The Hindus of Kashmir have been nearly completely eradicated. Decades of conflict between Kashmiri separatists and Indian security forces have turned the valley into a war zone and left little room for anything but resentment and distrust between them. Still, the dream of Kashmiriyat lives on. In a poll conducted in Srinagar in 2007, 84% of people, nearly all Muslim, wanted to see Hindus return to the valley. In reality, such a thing seems impossible.
Yeah, I was gonna say, why they want them to come back? It seemed like they did everything they could to get rid of them.
For many Hindus, the trauma is too great, and the chance of violence occurring again is too high. Kashmir remains one of the most volatile and delicate geopolitical fault lines in the world, with a long and bloody history of conflict that shows no signs of slowing down. The exodus of the Hindus seems then to be a miserable final chapter in the story of Hindus in Kashmir, and another grim entry in the list of tragedies that have plagued Kashmir for decades.
That's absolutely insane. You wouldn't know what to do. You have to leave. If you were a Hindu, you legit have to leave. Because there was too much of them being killed. And like I said, this video only gave it from one perspective. I'm not sure what happened from the Muslim perspective. But this video is just horrifying, scary, evil, heartbreaking. I don't know what else to say. My God. That's all we have here. If you enjoyed that reaction video, make sure you check out this one as well. It's your boy Neal, out.